All right. Good morning, everybody. How are you?
Good morning.
Good, good. My name is Christian Murgy. I'm the manager of public programs with the York County History Center. So thank you so much for coming out to our February edition of Second Saturday. So today is Dr. Peter Levy. He was a full professor in the Department of History and Political Science at York College of Pennsylvania, where he taught courses on recent America, civil rights movement, and the race and justice until his retirement last spring. He is the author of over a dozen books, including The Great Uprising, Race Riots in Urban America during the 1960s, as well as numerous articles and essays, including Revisiting York's Revolts, which was published in the Journal of York County Heritage in 2019. He was been the recipient of a number of awards, including the York College Professional Service and Leadership Award in 2012, and has participated in 3 NEH summer seminars. While he was born and raised in California, he has lived in Towson, Maryland since he began teaching in New York in 1989. Drawing on his recently published book, The Great Uprising, Race Riots in Urban America, Dr. Peter Levy will present an overview of the causes and consequences of York's revolt, in addition to providing a framework for better understanding York's and well over 300 revolts that took place during the 1960s. Levy hopes to stimulate a discussion of why it is important to examine them rather than hide the uncomfortable parts of our past. So, without further ado, Dr. Peter Levy.
Thank you, Christian. You're welcome. And I think that's on the leaf. You just summarized it. And first, I want to thank people for coming out. It's a real pleasure here, as I have at least a couple of former students. I didn't even recognize Scott at first. And that's, always been a pleasure. I always enjoy teaching. I have to admit, I'm a little surprised I've retired and I'm not missing teaching as much as I thought I would. But for 40 years, I taught 35 plus at York, and to have some of my star students continue on with the flame of history is really great. I also want to thank the History Center for inviting me here. I did a good deal of the research for at least the York part of the book here, going through microfilm in an age before there was newspapers.com, and there's no indexes, where all you would do is go like this in a microfilm machine. If you were lucky, the printer worked, but at 50 cents a page, I have a lot of real scratchy notes. In fact, just this week, by a total accident, or just serendipitously, the son of someone I talk about in this book found this book and called me up, and we had a really nice conversation. But I discovered that I misspelled his father's name. His name was Lionel, and I think I spelled 2 L's rather than 1 L at the, and it's probably because I have the worst handwriting, and I probably wrote his name down, Lionel with 2 L's, or couldn't read it. So if there ever is another edition, hopefully to make those corrections. As Christian said, my goal today is really to try to provide first a bigger context and framework for understanding the race revolts that took place in the United States during the 1960s into the early 1970s. And then about 2-3 slides in, I will start to focus in on York to see the degree to which I think it fits the mold, or fits the pattern, or doesn't. I realize this for some people is a difficult topic. This is, we don't, it's Black History Month, and even within those for now 100 years have been promoting the idea of first Black History Week, and then Black History Month. I think there's been a tension between, do we use it to kind of build up to have celebratory moments, or do we also look at the underside of history? So this is a little bit more of an underside of history topic. So Christian's going to do a little sleight of hand here. I did a few changes here. We're going to do a little ad-libbing. So after I wrote this book, I also put together, with the help of a computer scientist, a website. So can we get the website up? And I think the website helps here. So between roughly 1964 and 1970, the United States experienced, and here I'm going to read from the introduction of my book, over 700 urban revolts. Upwards of 525 cities were affected, including nearly everyone with a Black population over 50,000. The 2 largest waves of uprisings came during the summer of 1967 and during the Holy Week in 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In those 2 years alone, 125 people were killed, nearly 7,000 were injured, and approximately 45,000 arrests were made. And property damage topped 127 million, or approximately $1 billion in today's dollars. And this does not take into account a large wave of prison revolts and racially oriented unrest at the nation's high schools. Considered collectively with the advantage of hindsight, these revolts constituted what I call the Great Uprising, a term neither contemporary pundits and social scientists nor historians have employed till recently. Like the Great War and the Great Depression, the Great Uprising was one of the central developments of modern American history. And so if you Google Great Uprising website, and just be careful what returns you get, you might find this. You might find this website, and it's kind of, I think it's kind of cool. I have a lot of students help me with this in terms of digging up data. You can go to any one of the dots, and if they work, so if you went to Lancaster, or Harrisburg, or Carlisle, or York, so those are 4 cities just in the region that had some form of revolt, what you probably will find is a little synopsis of roughly 1 or 2 paragraphs that just tries to provide the what took place, largely pulled from local newspapers. And then there are other parts of the website in which there's kind of a historiography of the understanding of race revolts and the like. So I just thought I would share that with you, so we can go back to the main stuff, and then Christian's relieved from his technical duties.
It's like on the bottom side.
Yes, I want to go
Down.
Thank you. Sorry. So before I focus on York's revolt, let me briefly explain how I came to this broader project. So over 20 years ago, I was looking for a project, and I wanted to write about the civil rights movement, and I said I wanted to do it on a single community. This is actually about a year or 2 before I came to York in 1989. And I decided for a variety of reasons to look at a city called Cambridge, Maryland. And one of the reasons I chose Cambridge, Maryland is I had learned that there had been an infamous riot there when a person named H. Rap Brown gave a fiery address. He was accused of inciting this riot. And matter of fact, this event, for those who, I think most in this audience, Jamie's a historian, so she might know, but the rest of you maybe were alive, actually was in many ways responsible for the rise of Spiro Agnew, who was at the time just a first-term governor, to becoming vice president of the United States. So he became governor in 1966. Within 2 years, he was getting the nomination to be Nixon's vice president. And for those of us who remember when McCain nominated Palin, people wondering who Palin was. With Agnew, it was even worse. It was really like, Agnew who? That was almost the headline. Well, Agnew had made himself famous by going from being a traditional Rockefeller moderate Republican, essentially he won because of the black vote, to a voice of the new right. I still hear echoes of Agnew all the time today. But he was a little more respectable than Wallace because he had come from more moderate roots, and he went after H. Rap Brown. So I did a study at Cambridge. Out of that, I was invited then to be part of a group that was going to look at race revolts that had taken place in Baltimore in 1968. Now, the revolts that are most famous that everyone most has heard of, Watts, Los Angeles, 1965, Newark and Detroit in 1967. Baltimore had one of the largest revolts following King's assassination in 1968. But I moved to Baltimore. I lived there for 20 years. Never knew that Baltimore had a revolt, but it was quite serious. 50,000 National Guard were brought into Baltimore. That's a pretty serious event. So 40 years afterwards, the University of Baltimore wanted to examine what took place in Baltimore. So I became part of a group that held conference, ultimately wrote a book that had a series of essays on it. Meanwhile, I'm teaching at York. So I started in 1989. And the first inkling I ever got of York, not a Yorker, grew up in California, as Kristen said, then New York. Was from a fellow student of mine, a woman named Karen Rice. And some of you may even know Karen. Karen is in charge of the library special collections archives at York College. She was a non-traditional student. She said, "Can I write my senior seminar paper on York?" riots. But she had a caveat. She says, I want to do an oral history. I can't tell you the names of the people I'm interviewing. Okay, I'll let you do it, but why? And she kind of said, well, it's still kind of dangerous to talk about this. This is a hush hush topic. We don't discuss this. And meanwhile, number of years later, Charlie Robertson, who was the mayor of the city, is arrested and charged in relationship to charge with a murder of Lillie Belle Allen during the revolt of 1969. He had been a police officer, and what had been a hush-hush topic becomes not just local news or national news, but literally, papers from Australia are starting to cover York, Pennsylvania. And so I had other students who had started getting interested. So in many ways, much of my work on York, grew out of probably 2 or 3 different student theses who went through newspapers and did oral histories and dug around and got me interested in writing about York as well. And out of this, ultimately, I decided to propose a book, which became the Great Uprising, which would use these 3 separate incidents to try to have a better understanding of the revolts at large. And it may seem like a strange selection, but I could come up with a rationalization for anything, but I thought it was a good one, which was Cambridge was a small city, roughly under 20,000. York was a mid-sized community, and Baltimore was a large community. They also had kind of different racial makeups in terms of percentage of the Black population. And ultimately, I was able to convince a publisher that that made sense. That's kind of how it works. So anyway, well, got the right arrow here. So I had 3 primary questions, and they weren't particularly original questions. The questions were what took place, why did the riots take place, and what should be done, or in my case, what was done. These are the questions that the Kerner Commission, which President Johnson had established in the wake of the 1967 riots, had charged the commission with answering. And the Kerner Report is a famous document. And I think it's quite a very interesting collection of both scholars and politicians who were part of the Kerner Commission. Probably the most important politician on the commission was a guy named John Lindsay, who was the Republican mayor of New York. It's called the Kerner Commission because Kerner was the Republican governor from the state of Illinois at the time, so the bipartisan people. But it also had a bevy of social scientists who were doing most of the research. So these are the questions I was hoping if I looked at these 3 cities, and we're going to look at York and try and answer them. What is can I give an objective discussion or description of the sequence of events that took place in these communities, and larger why? Why did it take place? Could we find certain patterns? When I began my research, there were essentially 2 schools of thoughts or 2 interpretations, 2 broad views in terms of that second question. Why? On the one hand, this one was captured by this book written by a man named Eugene Methvin. Now, Methvin may not be a name that many of us know, and I don't know it. In fact, he was a quite popular author at the time. Often appeared in Reader's Digest. So this is a broad public audience, but there are also scholars who had views that dovetailed with Methvin. And his view is encapsulated by the title of his book, The Riot Makers. That riots were made by agitators, by radicals, by outside agitators often. But in addition to people who were looting or burning or on the streets, they were people who were apolitical, who were not part of the civil rights movement, who were rioting largely, as Edward Banfield put it, for the fun and profit of it. Something happened and this was an opportunity to get a TV, to get some free booze. They weren't politicized at all. There was no kind of reason aside for opportunity. The Kerner Commission, in contrast, came to the conclusion, and they used the word civil disorders, they used the word riots, that the disorders grew out of social conditions that the majority of Black Americans faced at the time, and made the argument that we were moving toward 2 societies, one Black, one white, separate but unequal and unequal. It disagreed, it looked for, actually, when Johnson appointed the Kerner Commission, he expected to find that radicals had caused the riots. It didn't find evidence of that. It took testimony from everyone from J. Hoover to police officers, so they had plenty of information. Now, Hoover was unwilling at the time to reveal that had already kind of begun surveillance programs in the Black communities, including spying on Martin Luther King. It was actually the revolts that sparked the turning up of that and creating something known as COINTELPRO, Black Hate Program, which went beyond just gathering information, but actually trying to undermine the civil rights movement. But there was really no evidence that radical agitators had caused this. In fact, one of the things that I found or argued in my book that A. Brown, who was the poster boy for a black radical who had caused a riot because he had gone to Cambridge and said in this town, don't come around, we should burn down, and a fire started later that evening. So it certainly looked like he had caused a riot. I hadn't caused that riot. In fact, and the Kerner Commission knew that. They had the records of the state troopers minute by minute, hour by hour. Brown spoke and finished around 10. Nothing happened until about 1 o'clock. Brown was long out of town. They couldn't put out the fire. The fire department really did not like the civil rights activists. They had odds with them for 10 years and just refused to put out the fire, and the fire grew. And the Kerner Commission knew this and left it out of the report. And it actually took me till I wrote this book that I figured that out. It just they had some stuff on Cambridge, but they just left this stuff out. Just that was too dangerous. It's already, as it was, Johnson just kind of took the Kerner Commission report and threw it away. This was political trouble. So those kind of were the two theories that most people had. And we actually find that at the time and today, while scholars by and large tend toward the Kerner Commission's interpretation, the public still holds the view of Eugene Levy. That is, it's outside agitators who cause riots, and riots are not political acts. So I just have these two polls. One is from 1968 and asked the question, the conclusion of the committee was that the nation was moving to two societies. Do you agree or disagree? And we see that nationwide, 51% of Americans said, no, we're not two societies. We're not moving in that direction. So that they had a progressive narrative. 2015, here I do a more localized poll. This is after the revolt in Baltimore, known as the Freddie Gray Revolt. People were asked the question, are these disturbances due to people with longstanding frustrations about police mistreatment, or did people use this as an excuse to loot? Now, here the polls actually broken down between white and black respondents. And the differences are they stand out. 60% of black respondents are saying, no, this is due to mistreatment. This isn't, this isn't an excuse. Whereas white respondents, only 32% of white respondents thought that the revolts had anything to do with mistreatment. So the public at large still is divided in terms of understanding revolts. So we turn to York. So what I found in York, particularly in terms of the second question, which is why they occur, there's a good deal of evidence to support the Kerner Commission's interpretation. So I'll try to go through these a little bit piece by piece. First, one of the ways black and white society was different at the time as well is that we live in residentially segregated spaces. Blacks and whites live separated from each other and in unequal conditions. So a student of mine, Brandon McDonald, was flirting with GIS, and so he helped construct these maps. So this is based upon the 1960 census data, and what it pretty clearly shows, it's a little hard to read the data here, but there were essentially 3 neighborhoods where African Americans lived in York in 1960, and the 1970 data wouldn't have changed that much. You would have had a larger black population in these communities. But in other parts of York, you would have seen very little change. And in the suburbs, there is still only at best a very, very, very small black population. Moreover, if you then were to zoom in on the neighborhoods, let's say particularly this neighborhood, where you saw large numbers of African Americans, you would see how unequal the housing was. It wasn't simply that blacks and whites lived in separate neighborhoods, they lived in unequal housing. This was a photograph that was published in one of the York newspapers. And it's interesting, across the street, Mr. Schmidt used to meet with the publisher of this newspaper. And at the time, and eat breakfast together. And at the time, or they would meet for meals. Mr. Schmidt would meal. Mr. Schmidt started to complain, I can't enjoy my breakfast when there's these pictures like this in the newspaper. And Schmidt wanted to see us to town and get kind of said, well, then do something about the housing. And we could find various things actually located at the archives here. So for example, planning reports, etc., things that came down from the Department of Housing, Urban Development that would show that a very high percentage of the houses in this area, in these areas were what were defined as substandard. And zoning laws were not being enforced. And even that one was a tough one because if you enforce them, what happens to the people who are in the homes? Now, in fact, some of the white communities that were on the edge of this, they also had high substandard housing. These were houses that actually were not increasing in value, and that may have caused some of the tension between Black and white communities. In addition, in city after city, the Kerner Commission found that poor relations with the police, which were also kind of maybe a reflection of poor relations with City Hall, were one of the problems. This was the mayor, John Snyder, and in the 1960s, he developed a canine force, a German Shepherd dogs. You know, just out of public relations alone, this is a bad move. You know, probably, you know, most fifth graders probably have seen pictures of German Shepherd dogs attacking nonviolent protesters in Birmingham, and you would think, well, maybe we shouldn't be growing this force. But moreover, the argument of a lot of Black people at the time and later in oral histories was that the dogs were being used in a discriminating way against Black youth, particularly Black male youth. So I have two quotes here. Came from later in time. One from Stephen Freeland, just trying to say, you know, and like a lot of Black families who came from up south, you know, they may be seen or had the belief that the North was going to be the promised land. My favorite immigrant movie is actually American Tail, where they think the streets are paved with cheese. There's no cats here, but I'm going to be a certain age to know that one. But they thought this, you know, the promised land and things were going to get better. And Freeland is making the statement, no, at the time racism was everywhere. What the people felt was going on in the South it wasn't only going on down there; it was going on right here. One of the subjects I've been, you know, looking at a lot is really members of the press here. And the York paper actually was quite progressive, but reporting on civil rights in the South and reporting on civil rights in the North by the press at the time was really quite biased. I mean, it really wasn't good. In many ways, it was a friend of the civil rights movement in the South, but didn't do always the best job of investigating problems at home. And part of the problem is how do you portray that? So, you know, a photo like this, you know, it's somewhat depressing, but it's not the same as an action photo, say, of a German Shepherd dog attacking someone. You know, remember also this is a period of like Life magazine, look, photographs or TV. It's harder to capture ongoing kind of structural racism than it is people being attacked. And didn't always catch the dogs going after Black people. No, actually, at times the newspaper here and the police got in conflict this way, particularly during the Bobby Simpson, who was a kind of a youth in the 1960s, did an oral history with a York student before my time. And he was actually reluctant to talk about the revolts many other times. But in this, you know, he made the statement that when we were kids, the Vandergreen and the Sweeneys and other racist police used to make us get off the front porch. Sweeney would declare you, and he would use the N-word and put his dogs on us. He never gave you any respect. There was nothing you could do. So it was just, you know, one testimony of the bad relations. Now there was newspaper coverage, but it wasn't steady or as thorough probably as I would have liked as a historian of the fact that there were protests. So one of the arguments I make is that the Kerner Commission actually came with a good foundation for understanding the revolts, but left out a crucial ingredient or a crucial factor, which wasn't simply that we lived in two separate societies. It wasn't that there was unequal society, but that African Americans all across America in the North or in other communities were protesting against these conditions, and there still was no change. And if you think about it, you know, if you ever think about kind of I'd say history books discussion of our traditional sense of the notion of the civil rights movement, generally speaking, what we have a sense of is, well, the civil rights movement took place in the South. And then in 1965, they walked across that bridge at Selma and they won voting rights. And then all of a sudden, like, oh, Black Power appears, the Black Panthers appear in the North, as if there had never been protest beforehand. In fact, the single largest civil rights protest in the entire history of the post-war period took place in 1964 in New York City at the time of the World's Fair against segregated education in New York City. That's an example. You can find it in the Times, but the amount of coverage it gets compared to what's taking place in Birmingham, Mississippi, and Selma is incandescent. So, these headlines give you an example. This photo here, we have protests outside City Hall against various social and economic conditions or inequalities. We have marches against inequality, CORE, which was one of the famous civil rights organizations, brings James Farmer into town. Farmer gives a presentation, says, look, the slums here are as bad as anything I've seen anywhere. And nothing's being done about it. Ultimately, in 1968, kind of out of these protests, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Committee is brought in to hold investigations and hearings. And it holds hearings. I happen to have, if anyone wants to look at it, as much as I can. I think I got kind of the press release and its report here, and they are damning. But what's more interesting to me is not just that they're damning, is the response essentially of the political elite to them. So here I might even have to read a little more precise. Rather than respond constructively to accusations, many white officials reacted belligerently. When Nathan Agron, the general counsel for the committee, began to question Mayor Snyder, Snyder bolted from his seat. When he did not return, the city solicitor defended his action and accused the commission of harassing the mayor. The following day, Corporal Peter Chantilly of York went out of his way to disrupt the hearings, openly calling it useless and warning one of the witnesses that, quote, he better get his goddamn facts straight or I'll fix you. When reporters asked the director of public safety if Chantilly would face discipline for his outburst, Post responded that Chantilly would not. So I would argue, just to kind of recap it, that one of the causes of the revolt is not simply the conditions, but that the racial status quo essentially remained unchanged. And so, like a boiling pot, eventually it will explode, but it's not an explosion that people should have been surprised. When Watts had exploded in 1965, Mayor Sam Fiordi, who was the mayor of Los Angeles at the time, and Pat Brown, who was the Democrat governor of California, basically responded, well, if anyone had told me there were problems, I would have done something. At which point then essentially the civil rights community says, well, God, there have been protests in the city for years, particularly against housing. In fact, there had actually been a referendum in California about open housing, and the voters had voted down a law that would have made it illegal to discriminate. So yes, they do. So here I Mayor Snyder attack. In addition, so one thing we do as historians is try to how to get the pulse of people's views. And as inaccurate as it is, we can look at political elections. We can look at political elections and votes. Try to get a sense of overall views. Because there aren't pollsters out in New York asking people's views of exactly this time. So in 1964, Lyndon Johnson, might be surprised almost most people who live in New York today, won overwhelmingly, almost by 2-1 against Barry Goldwater. In fact, up until 1960, I think, York was kind of a barometer for elections. It almost always chose the winner. And the argument for why it failed in 1960 was largely because John F. Kennedy was a Catholic and probably lost some votes that traditionally you would win. So in 1964, the nation's going for Johnson, and so was York. It was a fairly kind of middle of the road community that went one way or the other and didn't like the extremes. And Barry Goldwater was seen as the extreme, which, it supported Eisenhower, it supported Roosevelt. In the 1920s, it supported Hoover and Coolidge. That was pretty mainstream. So kind of middle of the road. We see by 1968 that the Democratic candidate, Humphrey, has, just plummeted in support. Nixon's support is about where it was in 1960, actually. But, really substantial part of the population is voting for George Wallace, who was an out and out segregationist. I mean, that's what he made his name for. You give an inaugural address in Alabama in 1963 saying segregation now, segregation forever. They kind of know what you stand for. He's not trying to hide it. So we could take that election, I think, as somewhat of a barometer of broader public change, of a shift to the right. And Nixon himself, I would argue, was shifting his politics to the right. We forget it wasn't Donald Trump, but it was Richard Nixon who first promoted the idea of law and order as a way to win political elections. So in 1968, and sometimes when I did some oral histories, I think people were a little confused by the chronology. Here we get to what took place. In 1968, New York experienced what I call several mini riots, each one precipitated by an encounter between Black youth and the police. In the first instance, policemen chased Blacks out of Penn Park, arguing that they were violating curfew. And in fact, investigators found that there was no law that they were violating, but that this was, pretty common practice historically, that the policeman told you, as Robbie Simpson just said, to get off the corner. Yeah, you got off the corner. And this led to the policeman being charged with firing at this youth. At first, they denied they had fired at the youth. They hadn't, though investigation showed that in fact shots had been fired. Subsequently, an event took place. I want to get this right, at Hoffman's Meat Market, in which a man named Chester Roach began to shoot at youths who were outside, above the market he lived, and he claimed they were being too noisy, so he started to shoot at them with a shotgun. And when police came, they essentially took him into protective custody. He was charged but never tried. Nothing ever happened to him. And this really angered Blacks. There was discussion nationwide by now of the ways that police were operating in discriminatory fashion. And they came up with some pretty strong statements about how they were being abused. One person saying that, sure, we'll have for the next slide. But yeah, so I have it still. So when Roach fired upon, one person said, "This is open warfare." Whitey made the statement last night. He said, "I hate you, Dick, and I'm going to kill you." So maybe if Whitey's going to start shooting, you better bet I'm fighting back. Still, another teen who had been involved stated that he never thought much about Black power philosophy, but that the Roach shooting changed his mind, adding, "If he had been Black, do you think the cops would have left him in there firing a gun? Man, if a Black man had been in that house, they would have bombed him out." The third incident involved a series of fights that took place after a football game, in which case the police dogs were used to break up the fights, but the police dogs were used only against Black youths, not against the white youths. And it wasn't a Black-white fight. The fight, as far as I can tell, was between Yorkers and people from Camp Hill who had come to play in the football game. So, and then once again, the police are denying that they're using the police dogs to destroy the fashion. It's interesting because I did interview a bunch of people, white and Black, about their memory of dogs. And memories were just totally different. And I have to admit, I have my own bias here. I remember as a kid, Officer Ernie used to come into school and he would show us the German Shepherd dogs. And we thought they were the coolest thing. They would put on this protective gear and he'd have them bite them and they'd show how they would use the dog to go after criminals. I never felt threatened by the police or by police dogs, but almost uniformly, particularly young Blacks, felt quite the opposite, that the dogs were not being used to protect people. They were being used quite rather to control them. And I think it's important to remember kind of the different ways we view things. So this map and chronology that was given at the newspaper pretty much after the time, I think is a pretty good kind of rundown of the basic sequence of events. So I'll try to read through it because it's going to be a little hard to compare. So on July 17th, a false rumor was spread that a black youth had been burned by white youth, sparking gang violence in Newberry and Gay Streets. Also that night, 2 youths were shot at West Philadelphia Street and North Pershing Avenue while talking to a city director. 6 people were wounded in gunfire that night, and others were injured by other objects. At 9 p.m. to 7 a.m., a curfew was imposed on the city. July 18th, 11 more people were hit by gunfire, and violence continued. Let me just pause for a second. In most of the revolts of the 1960s, the most prominent kind of action was looting and arson. There's gunfire right from the first. It's a quite severe, if you were to come up with some severity metric, killings would kind of guess, it's kind of like I don't know what modern statisticians would do this, it's like baseball, they come up with these modern stats, but of how do you measure the severity of it? Gunfire is worse than looting. York has a lot of it. The city police patrolman Henry Shadd, I always forget if I'm mispronouncing his last name, was shot, and he died 13 days later. He had been in an armored carrier at the time. July 20th, 3 dozen state policemen joined York City Police. On the 21st, Lillie Belle Allen, and 27th, Aiken, South Carolina, was fatally shot by use of Newberry Street. Governor Schaefer called in the National Guard. July 27th, Schaefer proclaimed a state of emergency and imposed a curfew. And then things began to calm down. Now, I said this was a pretty good representation. So often what we found when we look at the past is it's not just a matter of detail, but what's left out. I think it's important to think about what is left out. So to me, the most important thing is up in that first paragraph. It says that 2 youths are shot. I think it's important because it's leaving out a very important qualifier and descriptive factor. 2 youths who were shot were 2 black youths. And as white and black youths have been fighting for years. Down at the country fair, there were gang fights, fisticuffs over various stuff. This is the first time that I could find that someone was shot. Here was an escalation. They were shot while talking to policemen. And the policeman's reaction is, go get the white youths and arrest them? No, they were subsequently later arrested, but it was some time had passed after all these events. So it's the question is, are the police on our side? So at this point, I think what you see is the black community says we cannot trust the police to protect us. Most of the people, not all, most of the gunfire that was taking place in which whites were taking place with whites who were passing through the black community. Now, many of these whites were workers who would pass through there every day. We do need to remember that Shadd, though he was shot, he didn't die for 13 days. So the other thing it leaves out is the reaction of the police, particularly the shots. Police react, maybe we could argue correctly so, when one of their own is hurt. Usually quite vigorously. I was just telling Christmas story. I was driving home from Baltimore City yesterday. I live in Towson. It was 2 days ago. Before I know it, like 10 police cars dash by me with their lights on. When I get home and I find out, well, there's this person who just shot a cop who's on the run, and every policeman in Baltimore and Hampshire County was after him, essentially. And they were driving some strange cars. I'm convinced policemen have lights in their own cars because I had 2 pickup trucks drive me. I knew something was up, and then when I got home, I got a security alert to stand in place. I decided, okay, I'll follow that. So, and that's exactly how the police responded in York. Was shot. They responded with a similar mentality, but the mentality was aimed at the black community. The whites were doing the shooting as well. In fact, what they leave out is essentially there was a white power rally down at Farquhar Park, including police who were there riling them up. The degree to which they were riling up, maybe you guys can determine how much they were riling them up, but that was essentially the basis of the trial of Charlie Robertson years later. Was the argument the police were showing them that they had guns, or informing them either to get guns or suggesting that if they did get guns, they weren't going to take them away. They weren't going to the black community and saying, look, people who shot you, we're gonna equally help you out. It wasn't equal policing. And that's a structural thing. It's a structural thing because there were so few blacks on the police force. In fact, one of the black people who were on the police force quit and accused the police force of being racist during the middle of the revolts. There weren't that many police forces, and there were zero black firemen. So that's a structural thing. As the black population had grown in New York, the police force had become less and less representative of the community. That's a problem. So those are, important factors that I think are left out at the time, and it's an important silence. So then, what was done and what was not done afterwards? So somewhat to surprise, I think, of most people, that the people who had killed Shad and Allen were not arrested, essentially, for 30 years. And so the question is, why not? And particularly a police getting shot. It's really quite surprising that no arrests. So the traditional argument that has been made, the interpretation that I think I don't remember where I first pulled it up, was that there was a fear that if the killer of Allen was arrested, the killer of Shad was arrested, not the killer of Allen, that the black community would have another revolt. Wait, okay. We both lost one, essentially. I find that a little suspect. Just find out this is right. I'm more of the view that there was fear that if an investigation was done about Allen's death, it would lead to concern that the police had been involved with her death, or at least had covered up her death, and other misdeeds. For one, Allen drove into an area that was supposed to be restricted. It was supposed to be barriers that state troopers were manning, and they let her pass into the area. Newberry Street was like a war zone. I mean, there were literally hundreds of people out there with lots of guns. In the reporting, I left this out, that was done, it was mentioned that during this period, black homes were searched for weapons, and a good number were found. Guns and ammunition were also seized from the Messersmith's home, but the searches took place much more delayed. And there's probably good reason to believe that maybe the weapons that were used to kill Allen were out of the homes by that point in time. Much of the evidence important for convicting the people who killed Allen was not taken care of properly. Let's start with the fact that it's amazing only Allen was killed. There were 10 shots at their car. It was totally shot up. It got stuck on the railway tracks. Allen got out to try to move it, and she's trying to turn it around as there's people there with guns shooting at her, and she's just up visiting her relatives from Aiken, South Carolina, had been out of a picnic all day and went out to get some food for her kids. And there were all these theories for years about how she had a gun in the trunk. There were some theories that the car looked like the car of another black youth who had been in there. But the shots kept coming. Now you would think as a police force you'd want to keep that car and not lose it. There's evidence there. Maybe I watch too many crime shows. Maybe that's the, I realize there's a problem with all of us. We think the police are, out there getting every last hair and DNA test. But evidence was lost over time. Now it's interesting. The Department of Justice ordered the FBI to see if people's civil rights. Remember, one of the violations of civil rights is that police violate people's civil rights. And from what I could tell, I can't prove counterfactual here, but what I could tell is the FBI did kind of a sloppy job of pursuing this case. And so then we just have to kind of infer, well, why would the FBI do a sloppy job? And there's various explanations I can come up with. The best one I can come up with is essentially the FBI and the police and the state troopers are friends, and they want and enjoy probably a favorable relationship, and they don't want to upset that. And how much do they really want to push? And Hoover was not one necessarily throughout this period, except when he was really pushed, like in Mississippi in 1964, to go after essentially whites who had shot blacks. That's just a reality. That really wasn't his priority. So that case got, the Justice Department keeps sending memos. What have you found? And it's really, we found nothing. Tried to interview people, and there was I think a code of silence on both sides for years. to a certain extent, not to talk about. Hope I'm not going over this.
You're good.
Okay. So one of the questions also in terms of what was done, I think there was a short-term change for reform. And I've battled with this, gone back and forth. But you know, it was a kind of existential moment for the community of York, as it was for other communities. I think a lot of Yorkers thought it couldn't happen here. You know, it happened in a big city. You know, they think of York as Newark or Detroit or Los Angeles. Most importantly, a thing called charrettes, and I'm not going to have a chance to really talk about the charrettes. I largely became convinced that charrettes were a bona fide push to reform things in the city, really from the grassroots up. I mean, this image here is essentially of people posting stuff on the wall, and the idea was, well, let's bring people together. We'll just start almost like we do today, brainstorming. Okay, what's wrong here? And rather than top down, you might find, for example, there's a need for community health centers. You know, we find that health services not being provided to people where the health services needed. So maybe we can provide community health centers. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it's not what we just learn about elsewhere. And there was an article in the York Review that was written by Raoul. I always mispronounce his name. Let's see if I can read it. I have a better chance of giving proper credit. Uranaga that looked at the charrettes, and and Robertson said, he gives them credit for implementing some long-term important reforms. There was also at the time a suit by a number of members of the community against the political leaders and the police, and they got support from some pretty prominent attorneys, ACLU, NAACP attorneys, and the suit essentially was asking for outside supervision of the police. Says, we've given you a chance. This is a pretty radical measure. And they bring in all this testimony, much of it's dismissed, but still it's a pretty strong suit. And ultimately in the case, the plaintiffs, the people suing, lose. But the two main reasons they lose is because Mayor Snyder, whom we showed with the dogs before, had died of a heart attack. And so the new mayor, Eli Eichenberger, seems to, well, he's one of the defendants in the case. The judge rules, let's give him a chance. And second, the remedy, which is the idea of essentially outside supervision of the police, is deemed by the judge to be just too radical of a measure. Now, it's interesting that the last round of revolts, what we actually see is the city after city refers to the Baltimore. There have been consent decrees which have been established, which establishes some form of, okay, this has become a long-standing problem with police. Maybe we need some outside eyes on this to make sure reform is taking place. But in 1969, 1970, that was not. There's also structural factors. In some ways, we could see the revolts as early harbingers of these structural factors. But we see, for example, with this picture, that there's increasing concentrations of poverty, not just in York, but really virtually in every city. That the economy of York and other industrial cities begins to change. Some have complete deindustrialization, some maybe it's slow. So that the jobs that African Americans had moved north for with the Great Migration, rather than continuing to grow, they had already maybe begun to slow down in the 60s. That probably was true. Maybe not all jobs, but some of the jobs were moving out to the suburbs. I have a student at York right now who's trying to look at the kind of relationship between automobile production and suburbanization. And you find a lot of the new factories, like the Lordstown factory, they're not in the middle of the cities anymore. And so these long-term social and economic conditions, the decline of jobs, the place where the jobs are increasing poverty in the city. Residential segregation is a long-term problem with multiple causes. There's also political polarization. When I wrote this book, I don't think I realized how deep the political polarization is. I mean, the difference in voting of the county and the city was not as great in 1969 as it is today. And that's not just York, that's all over the country. We see that the urban-rural split is greater and greater, with the suburbs being the swing vote. So when someone like David Russ comes to the York community and comes up with proposals that the best way to solve problems is a regional effort, there's less support of it over time. I think it's harder and harder to garner regional support for solutions when we are politically polarized. Just on the way up, I was listening to a story about New Mexico. They're finding unanimous support for something in Mexico, and the reporter asked, "Well, aren't we kind of polarized?" And the support is to make roasted chilies the official smell of the state of New Mexico. For something like that, the whole state will get behind, Republican, Democrats. Division dissipates, but over something a little more substantial, we have a lot more difficulty finding common ground. The riots or revolts were revisited with the arrest of Mayor Charlie Robertson in the early 2000s. All of a sudden, York became major news. I found Yorkers got quite defensive about this. I would try to explain, don't forget, there were 500 communities in America that had race revolts. It was not unique. But the glare was on York. Many political leaders did not want the trials to take place. They were arguing that it would undo progress that had been made. Others felt they needed to be done. I think it kind of maybe Jim could probably certainly help out here, but I have a sense that it probably increased polarization or kind of tension in the city for a while. But I would argue it's maybe like the medicine that goes down. It doesn't taste good, but it's good for you. Which does lead us to the questions: why should we examine urban revolts? Why should we revisit these? Before I get to these statements, when I first began my study in Cambridge, 1987, I think, one of the first persons I talked to was a guy named Frederick Malkus. Frederick Malkus was a state senator from Dorchester County. He was at the time the senior Republican in the state of Maryland. If you ever go down to Ocean City and you were to go down Route 50 that way, you actually pass over the Frederick Malkus Bridge. It's quite a popular person. And I began to ask him questions about what took place in Cambridge. And his actual words were, "Why would you want to peel back that scab?" In other words, this was 1987. We don't really want to examine that. It's just going to be it's only have negative consequences. So my argument back, if I didn't make it in its faith at the time, is because by ignoring the history of uprisings or other unpleasant subjects, we perpetuate a false understanding of their causes. One which blames those who rebelled against the long history of racial discrimination for the problems that they were rebelling against. Put somewhat differently, if we refuse to peel back that scab, we must undermine efforts to consider the conditions that caused the revolts. Or as James Baldwin put it, we fail to recognize the rioters were not thugs who rioted for the fun of profit, but rather because they simply wanted to be treated as humans. One last slide. This is a longer quote by Baldwin. One day, to everyone's astonishment, someone drops a match in the powder keg, and everything blows up. Before the dust has settled or the blood has congealed, editorial speeches and civil rights commissions are loud in the land, demanding to know what happened. What happened is that the Negroes wanted to be treated like humans, or human beings. He said this in 1960. He said this years before, at a time when America was in the midst of this absolute celebration of itself, of American exceptionalism. And everyone except for, few intellectuals were writing Baldwin off as a kook. But if you don't trust Baldwin, if you think, well, this was radical, let's go to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was often asked about the 60s. I could have pulled out 100 quotes. This one. In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that Americans have failed to hear? It's failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last years. It's failed to hear that the promise of freedom and justice have not been met. It's failed to hear that the large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantees of riot prevention. With that, I open it up for questions and comments. I hope people like it. Thank you. Questions? Jim.
It was interesting to see, not surprising, but interesting to see that your map of where African Americans lived in 1960, I think it was. Or if you overlaid the redlining map of 1935, it's almost same.
In your paper, you were crucial in finding those redlining maps. I never was able to find them. Somehow, because there's some big cities in there.
The University of Virginia put them online.
I mean, and for those who don't know, redlining was the policy of the Federal Housing Administration to give loans to houses that were in certain areas and not give loans to others, those that were in the redlined area, were ineligible for those houses. And one of the definitions of whether you got the loan or not, one of the factors was if there were minorities or blacks in an area, it was redlining. It was deemed not an area that was safe for investment, essentially. Jim.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the K-9 unit and when it was dissolved and that process?
That's a good question about dissolve. So there were actually, I'm almost positive there were city council calls to dissolve the units, and during the 60s, and Snyder persistently ignored them. I can't tell you exactly. I know that those canine forces, I could probably find in the book, were grown, were increased in size. I probably started with a few dogs and probably went up to, I don't know, a half dozen. That sounds like large. But it was something that Snyder was quite proud of, as I think that picture portrayed. I mean, he's not using or deploying the dogs as a policeman, but I think that's symbolic. He wants to be seen as this is something that his administration is implementing, and despite calls for disbanding them, he refuses to do so. And I think we need to see the canine forces, and I began this work, I think, before historians were looking at somewhere, but looking at what they now call kind of the creation of a carceral state. But we often date war, the kind of growth of prisons, populations, countries, sometime in the 1970s, 1980s. But increasing historians are pushing that timeline backwards. As early as Johnson's passed the Civil Rights Act in '65, at the same time he's actually passing laws that are providing communities money to do things, to begin to say militarize the police or to crack down. There's no doubt that that's taking. And it is kind of this weird thing, because at the same time the courts are liberalizing things. So Miranda is all of a sudden creating things like protections against police abuse, which may lead to some of that backlash. I mean, Goldwater's a crucial figure, and I think Johnson's trying to cover his flank, because Goldwater tried to make crime a major issue. Didn't work for him. Nixon keeps it up. By '68, it becomes a big issue. I think police have become, those dogs become a symbol of that. I could probably take up somewhere in my old files of newspapers. I probably have some stories. You could do a newspapers.com. It's a lot easier than going to. Anyone else? Yes.
Are we on a trajectory for improvement in terms of segregation and unequal living conditions from 1969 to this time?
I'll bring that back. And I think we're all observers of the persistence of racial divide.
In terms of statistics, so
yeah, it's very so. I was just talking before. One of the people I'm looking at now is a person who lived in York for 30 years, and I wish I had talked to her. I didn't know Miss Daisy Myers, who in 1957, if you don't know her story, became Well, Daisy and her husband Bill became the first Black family to move to Levittown, Pennsylvania in 1957. Then moved back to in the 1970s, Harrisburg in the 60s. So the traditional view has been, well, cities became blacker and suburbs were white. Well, I just actually read this very interesting book about Black suburbanization, which goes back to the Civil War. There were always Black suburbs, actually. But the difference was until roughly 1970, so let's say the 68 Housing Act, which all of a sudden made it illegal officially to discriminate. But the Blacks by and large lived in Black suburbs. There were these kind of Black communities. One of the ironies is we often think about urban renewal made things worse for poor people, poor Blacks in the city by concentrating wealth. They also destroyed a lot of these Black suburbs, which were built to kind of just people just trying to get by. You know, they would build their own Black suburb. Now the only difference was, and use it, I don't know where Evanston, Illinois is, but it's like a nice neighborhood outside Chicago. But it's representative. There were always, say, in places like Evanston, places where the Black domestics used to live. And they actually then diminished over time in size or significance because fewer people have domestics now, you know, live in their communities. So we're beginning to see Blacks move out to more traditional suburbs, but they still tend to be relatively segregated. So it's not simply city versus suburbs anymore. I read a book years ago. I'm going to forget her name. I think the last name's Cashin. I think it's called Failure of the Dream. She was Thurgood Marshall's last clerk. And she wrote a book comparing Prince George County outside Washington, D.C. with the Virginia suburbs. And she argues essentially this dream of suburbanization, but it's kind of still racial suburbanization, hurts both communities. So that Blacks moved to Prince George's County because they felt more secure and because they could afford the housing, because there is a wealth gap that's built up over 30 years of not being allowed to move into the suburbs. And the education gap that goes with that. And at least at the time she was writing, she like compared the stores that were in Prince George's County with in Virginia. Virginia had like Tyson's Corner, which, you know, had every name brand store in the world, and Prince George County had the dollar store. You know, it really had. But for moving to Virginia, she argued there's a cost too, because essentially it's a surcharge for moving to a white suburb. You know, if you were to actually just compare the houses in one versus the other, they could be equal, but the cost of buying those houses is not even close to each other. You know, and that's, and insofar as a lot of white communities associate suburbs with better schools and safer conditions, they go, let's move to the white suburb. They're going to pay a premium for that. Well, let's not call it this. Let's call them a premium city. So I don't know if it's gotten how much more integrated we've really gotten. I mean, there are more African Americans in the suburbs of York County than there were 20, 30 years ago. But when I was at York College, once a year, we used to, about 4 or 5 years, hold an event in which we brought students in to talk about racial issues. Not just Black students, but white and Black students to become kind of leaders. And I was amazed how many Black students there were who were really, you know, they were still only the one Black student in, say, their class. You know, that was not that unusual. And they're not, I mean, I don't want to say that there's KKK or Nazi stuff went around. It was really more just these subtle stuff. And I'll just give you one example. The facilitator asked the question, when did you first become aware of race? And I'll admit I'm white. And a lot of us had to think. And I think a lot of us aren't sure. I wasn't sure. Every Black kid there knew, you know, it was like between the age of 3 or 5, something had happened, usually some question about their hair. Or something that all of a sudden put them on the defense. Yeah, and the people who are asking the questions are, I don't think they're racist in that way, but they, you know, they just something that made them aware of it. It's different than the old days in the South. You know, your mom would have to take you to a water fountain, and the little kid would ask, you know, black water fountain, white water fountain, and the precocious kid would take a drink out of both and say they taste the same to me. The mom would have to say, don't do that again, or you're going to get in trouble. So I think we still, I would like to see statistics. I am not convinced that actually we live, if you do it on a national level, in a less segregated society. We forget that particularly in the South, areas often were not residential. Blacks and whites lived next to each other until a more modern era.
Rusk 3.0, which the History Center and the Daily Record Commission in 2019 shows on population shifts. And there's substantial integration along 83. The Central School District is 35% Black and Latino and whites. So there has been movement. The concentration in York City, as there's 8% Black population decline in York City. And so the concentration, and also concentration of poverty in New York City has improved from severe to moderate. So there's a lot of movement going on, according to Rusk.
And I think the Times just had a story about urban centers across America are becoming whiter. As people have moved into, the class can be the best examples. Washington D.C., which was for years was called the chocolate city. And now Blacks are being pushed. There's a gentrification taking place in Washington. It's class based.
Yeah.
All right. Look at this audience. Okay, it's few and far between. The average age is 60, and it's Lillie White. Okay, had an earlier slide with the elections, Johnson, and then Houston. York is a southern town. It's the South. You go to the election records. In Lincoln, York voted twice against Lincoln. They hated why, but he was a radical. Oh my gosh. That hasn't changed. LBJ was a Southerner first. 64. It's coming after Kennedy, but he feels sorry because of the assassination. But he hadn't done his record. He hasn't done the civil rights. That came after in his first war. And then you had a revolt. That was Nixon taking over. Because LBJ escaped. I signed these, and I'm going to lose it. And he did. And Nixon said, great. But York has always been, and York County has always been all whites. That's why. Maybe this is crazy. The abolitionists, it's nice. And the movement of blacks is not the southern area, to get out of it. And I think of more, be in Pittsburgh or Canada, to go east, Lancaster, Philly, and then out of the country, and then to Canada. That's the safest route. Here's an example. York loves its markets. Central market, Eastern market. The only market that was built by one of its esteemed architects was torn down in York City. One of the biggest markets, but the top is rubble. It's never been touched. It's still there. Why? I didn't grow up, but there's never been an improvement in that section. There's never been a store there or anything. It's level, purposely level. Look at all the new schools that opened up with choice. That mean, well, I don't want to associate anyone else. Associate only with people that want to associate. York hasn't changed. York is on a nice space. We all put on a nice space. The paper had an interesting article a couple months ago. Early 1820s. There were fires that are occurring in New York City. So what do? It has the law designated any black citizen, or any black resident had to get a pass. Whether you could prove yourself free man or slave, that doesn't matter. You had to have a pass, you had to have permission to be in this location. There was problems. That's good. You can trace the red line at one of the major supermarkets, Fringe, York. Because it's cheaper. And cheaper because of loan making that small markets or those facilities are not wrong if you go outside. But it's always been wrong. There's always been a ring around. And most cities, because involved and there isn't a large parking space. These are my comments.
No, I think, and already I'm interested in the, I had never heard of, I'm not from York, it's again, the fact that the York market wasn't recreated, and I want to go back to my map and figure out where would it be located, and you know, that, and that's probably pretty true, you know, it may have to do with urban renewal money at the first place, you know, where were they, what were they knocking down, because that's the argument, that they were knocking down certain things.
But who's in charge of urban renewal?
No, well, that's right, yeah.
And then you can go through the when Eisenhower created the interstate highway bill. Well, that was a golden opportunity. You want to put it through this area, or split, or run it right through and split this neighborhood in half, or this drive.
I mean, if I had any real response, it is the question of the southern peculiarity of York. I'm not going to deny that there are southern aspects of York, but my suggestion is we actually probably go back to my original map where we had all those dots. I can ask Christian to do that, but you will find areas that are not southern at all. You know, in fact, there was one dissertation written arguing that the most severe revolts and the most severe racism is in the Midwest. And that though there are very large black communities, and Chicago is the single kind of largest contiguous black community, it's the most segregated city in the country. Mount Pleasant, Michigan had one of the most severe, you know, small town revolts of the time. You know, there are probably people blaming southern migrants, and there were southern migrants to the north to get jobs at the Ford factories, just as there were, you know, both black and white. But I think it kind of misses the point that you could object to slavery and still be a racist. And to me, the single best example of that in American history is the Battle of Gettysburg is won. Troops have to go to New York City to put down what is still today the largest riot in American history, the New York City draft riots. You know, where did these Irish, who had never encountered an African or an African-American, pick up racism so quickly? But pretty quickly they were picking up the cue that somehow or another, the way to make it was to identify as white. Because those riots were not just against the wealthy. I mean, colored orphanages were raided, and blacks were lynched on lampposts, and the venom of those events, and then they were forgotten to history by and large. You ever see, what was the great G. Pardue movie about? It's the worst movie in terms of accuracy, but they show the riots. It's I'm forgetting, Gangs of New York. You know, it's worth watching the action. You know, it just gives you a sense of what those were violent events. As far as I know, Barnum's, Bailey's, elephants weren't running through the city in the middle of the revolts, but they had to bring troops in. They bombed the federal troops had to put down what was essentially a race riot, a race and a class riot. Things like Brooks Brothers was burned down too, because you you could buy your way out of the draft, like J.P. Morgan did. So I I agree with the southern aspect. I think it still needs to be kind of parsed out more. I think it's good. Goodrich here had an underground railroad house. I agree with you. My understanding is that there were Yorkers who joined the whites in the Christianity riots to try to capture the people in the Christianity riots, and try the people who protected blacks there, and the blacks who fought back. And I know it's an endless debate over the Civil War. Would given the chance, would they have burned the city? Would they have allowed the city to burn down or not?
I'm a lifetime Yorker. I spent about a decade in Virginia, but I grew up here. And I wanted to commend the language. I'm an ELA teacher. And I want to commend the language. I really appreciate, because I grew up hearing about the race riots. And I believe the title of the session is about revolt instead of riot. And the idea of the Great Uprising, I really very much appreciate that. And because I appreciate that so much, I think it is important when we say Southern, that's not a synonym for racist or Confederate, because we definitely in York, we have so much of our geography that goes right across that Mason-Dixon line. So absolutely a lot of that influence goes back and forth. And there's unfortunately a large amount of racism and definitely a lot of problems here. But also I think we should be careful to say, to not label Southern when we mean racist, when we mean pro-segregation, when we mean, we should not identify that geographically.
Well, I intentionally use the word uprising or revolts, although at times I use the word riot because it becomes the nomenclature, and even the title, things get indexed. But I think there is a different meaning. There's different choices we can use. The Kerner Commission using civil disorders used almost social psychological language there. This is, it was a social psychological. Remember the old West Side Story song, Officer Krupke, maybe you don't know it. This is a social disease. That's how they were treating rights rather than a structural sort of problem. I think it's interesting you mentioned segregation, because I think there's a persistence also of thinking of a difference between what's called de jure and de facto segregation. So we have this notion that in the South they had what's called de jure legal segregation. There were these laws, and the laws were quite extensive. Could even play chess together. Or always have to be symbolized by, and here I can make the transition. In Mississippi, in 1964, 3 civil rights activists were killed, 2 white, 1 black, and they had to be buried in separate cemeteries. So York does not have, as far as I know, laws that led to separate cemeteries, but there are separate cemeteries. Is that, were there laws at one point? I think that's probably curious. I know Jamie's part of a project looking at cemeteries where people are buried, records that are lost. But there also were laws that segregated people. Redlining is an example, or at least policies the government was acting to create segregation. And I would also actually, there's laws of omission, things you're not doing. I think that's just as important that you were not enacting laws that say it was illegal to discriminate when you're going to sell a home. That's very important. Once or twice when I've given this presentation, I've had people, when we talk about residential segregation, say go home, and they would find in their deed, they still have the old covenant in their deed in York saying you cannot sell your house to blacks, Jews, or dogs, or pigs, or something like that. And now those covenants are not enforceable anymore. They haven't been for some time, but that they're still there, remind you that it was a deed is a legal document for a good deal of time. Even if you wanted to, it's in many ways almost a violation of kind of traditional property rights, and the property owner could not sell their home to who they wanted to, which is somewhat astounding. My daughter followed me in profession. Amazed that she chose to. We tried to push her to med school. Anyway, she's an expert, what's kind of called racial capitalism. It was a concept that I hadn't really thought that much about, but increasingly I'm convinced that actually green doesn't always win out. We need to understand the structures which capitalism has been racially based from the moment capitalism emerged. Capitalism emerged out of the slave trade, out of the meeting of the three continents. And it's at a racial basis from day one. And so I can agree, particularly when we think of South as being the racist. Northerners were part of that racial capitalism. They're having their own confrontation.
Briefly mentioned, you brought up the charrette, and I think one of the things that came out of the charrette was that York City, with York High, started to offer a Black history class, and this was the 69-70 class. So I don't know if we still have it there or not, but I don't recall the big uproar that there's going on now about offering this type of history to in school.
There's actually a really good dissertation written by a person who grew up in New York and then taught at Kutztown, I forget the name of the author, about William Penn High School in 1968 and the reaction to King's assassination, and gives the administration a certain degree of credit for reacting constructively to that, because I'll just personally, I remember I grew up in California and my sister was at school that was one of many schools. There were lots of high schools that were having disturbances at the time because the Black and white communities were divided. But there were also people in the schools, teachers and administrators, who were quite racist. Just we have to clear out this place. Almost a fumigation, I think, was the word. And I agree, as far as I can understand. I think the more I can learn about that, reforms that were made. I think I mentioned I'm starting to do some research on Daisy Myers. Daisy Myers had been a school teacher, and she becomes appointed right after that as what essentially is assistant principal at William Penn High School. And as far as I can tell, that there had been Black principals at Black schools in previous eras, but that there would be Black administrators at predominantly, it was still predominantly white school at the time, because she wasn't given the title of assistant principal. She was called an administrative assistant. Now, I think that's both racial and gender. Because, as I grew up, I never had administrators who were female until principals were always men. And that's changed substantially. So I'm glad to hear that. I think it's somewhere or another I did, and then, and eventually get a Black superintendent holiday as well. So in terms of curriculum, I guess I know in 69 and 70 after the revolt, so the fall of 69, there was trouble at William Penn High School still.
Yeah.
We were there, so we knew what it was about. There was protests from the Blacks over in Penn Park. They had to go over there because they couldn't do it in the building itself. Because there were too many racist teachers and administrators. Kind of blocking them from protesting inside the school. So they just moved it over to Penn Park.
And I think the other thing to remember, so I had a student, Alyssa, I forget Alyssa's name is, but I asked you to think of it not just in racial terms. We forget this is the middle of the Cultural Revolution for Blacks and whites as well. And one of the people I interviewed was a guy named Craig Fritz, who I worked with for years. And Craig would say, because he listened to Black music, he would get in trouble with his white friends, and the Black community was becoming more assertive of being Black. And quite often they might even have confrontations is the wrong word, but say at the dinner table, differences with their parents over hairstyles, over music they played. And I think once again, a symbol of that is Muhammad Ali. We forget how controversial Ali was at the time. Just that people even refused to use his name. He was the double whammy. He changed his name to Ali. He was a proud Black man, and I don't want to use the language, but the language was that he was, out of his place. And he had gotten out of the character we were used to of Black athletes. And I think that just, I think that added to it. I also think there was a gender element to it. I really do. That there was people who were very terrified. It's also taking place in terms of the women's rights movement, the women's liberation movement is just gone. I had my first work kind of looked at the 60s, and I looked at polls of things people were most scared about was gender change. It was like, would you want a Black person to live next to you? The answer was no. Would you want your daughter to wear a mini skirt? It was like 80%, so no, my daughter cannot wear a mini skirt, and, there was a fear, maybe rightfully so, that gender and sexuality were changing pretty quickly. And it wasn't, it terrified. There's a guy named Bill Mounts, who was one of my students. He teaches up, I think, at Dallestown High now, and he's been active politically as well. And he did a study of politics in this region. And his argument is that it actually was cultural issues. That was the real thing that polarized. Now, whether that becomes the excuse, but I don't think it's surprising. We still see the degree to which culture has remains a hot button issue. So when you mention what can you teach in class? I'm kind of excited that people are concerned about what history they teach in class. At least we're teaching history still. My bigger fear is that history's been removed from the curriculum. But the hot button issue is just changing, but there still is a core cultural division, or a belief that we can use culture to divide. Chris,
We are
at the ending time,
for tonight.
the bell's about to ring.
Thank you again, Dr. Peter Levy. Thank you again, everybody. I really, really enjoyed the discourse that we had with the questions that were posed to. So this was a lot of fun to be a part of, and thank you all for participating in it. Just a couple of quick things before we head on out for today. Dr. Levy's book, Great Uprising, is for sale at our bookstore if you would like to check that out. That's just around the corner. The museum is open today. Feel free to stop at the front desk and peruse through the collections you'd like. And a couple of things coming up. The next second Saturday is going to be March 11th. It is going to be Tom Davidson of the Lincoln Highway Legacy. They are getting a brand new Pennsylvania State Historic marker of the shoe house of Mahlon Haynes along Route 30. So March 11th, they're going to be talking about Mahlon Haynes and the shoe house and his legacy there. But things before that, on February 25th, it's a Saturday, the last Saturday of the month, Pennsylvania Genealogical Society is going to be hosting a seminar for beginners here at the meeting hall. That is running from 9 a.m. till 1 p.m. After that, you are free to break for lunch, but until 4 o'clock, you are also free to use the library and archives. It's all about getting started with genealogy, using databases, and what to look for to get you started. And then something new. As many of you may know, we do free guided walking tours on First Friday starting out on Beaver Street. First Friday in March is going to be a little different. It's going to be here. We are hosting Beer and Boards. It is a free 2-hour event of anything that you want to do with classic board games. Board games are going to be here in the museum. You're free to play for those 2 hours. Beer tickets we are selling for $8. You'll get 2 tickets to use a local selection of different beers for you to do so. So just a casual, relaxing First Friday coming up. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Levy, again. Enjoy the rest.